I want to thank everybody for joining us here. I think this will be a really interesting discussion, um, especially as we go into the midterm elections. There's a lot of preconceived ideas about what are issues that minority voters care about, what do they vote on, and I think we have a really interesting and diverse panel to kind of talk about those things and shed some light and some information that may not fit with some of the stereotypical ideas that you've heard either on the news or in mainstream media. So I'm really excited about this. We have a great panel. Our moderator is Sara Carter, the Sara Carter. Um, Sara Carter is the host of the Sara Carter Show podcast. She previously worked for the Sinclair News Group, the Los Angeles News Group, the Blaze, the Washington Times, and the Washington Examiner. She's written numerous exclusives for USA Today, US News and World Report, and she's also a Fox News contributor with expertise on the Southwest border and foreign affairs. You see her everywhere. Throughout her career, Carter has reported on a range of stories, including national security, terrorism, and immigration. She also delivered frontline coverage of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. She's a recipient of 2 National Headliner Awards. Carter was also awarded the Society of Professional Journalists nationally recognized Sigma Delta Chi Award for her multiple-part series in Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, that uncovered the brutality of the Gulf and the Sinaloa cartel wars along the border. In addition to her work for Fox News, Carter writes for SaraACarter.com, and I encourage you, she's also a terrific Twitter follow. So if you see her, look her up and follow her. She's always got a nose for news and is a great resource. So thank you, Sara, and the panelists. I will kick it off to you, Sara.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I gotta say that's really kind of you. I feel like I am everywhere. I'm actually right now I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. Beautiful state, a lot of culture, history, music here. And I was actually in Pennsylvania yesterday and had a chance to talk to some of the panelists before we got on live a little bit about what I was seeing. And a lot of it focuses on what we will be discussing today. It's true, I covered the border, I covered war zones, but I think the most important story of our time right now is our nation and our children and our families and our small businesses and our hope for a better future. And so I hope that this platform gives us an opportunity to share that with all of you, our ideas. What can we do to reach out to minority voters? A little background on me. My mother's family was from Cuba. I'm the firstborn here on my mother's side of the family. I'm very proud of that, very proud of my immigrant background, very proud of the fact that I speak Spanish fluently, and that I have, such a rich culture in my own family. JCN, Job Creators Network, thank you so much for hosting this amazing event. As you all well know, is the country's leading conservative small business advocacy organization. Thank you, Alfredo, because, and I will go to introduce each and every one of you separately, because as a small business owner and a minority, I think it's very important to have people that are advocating for all of us, right? This virtual event will explore how the minority vote is going to impact us come this November and impact our midterm elections. And I would say all the way through 2024. Our event features panelists from representing the African American, Hispanic, Asian American communities, as well as famed pollster Scott Rasmussen. I'm very excited to have you here. And we're going to share overviews about shifting political agendas within these groups and what we need to do better and what we're doing right now. So I'm going to start off right now with Alfredo Ortiz. Lo and behold, we have known each other for a very long time, Alfredo. I feel blessed to have you as a friend in my life. You are the president and CEO of Job Creators Network, where you lead the defense of small businesses from the onslaught, and I love this, of bad government policies. Thank you so much. He is a frequent commentator appearing on cable news networks, including my own Fox News and CNBC, as well as C-SPAN. His writings also regularly appear in national outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, CNBC, and The Hill. Born to Hispanic immigrants in Southern California, Alfredo witnessed his parents fight for their own slice of the American dream. And I think so many of us can relate to that, Alfredo. It's very important and that we talk about those issues too, and how our parents had to struggle. And now, as the head of Job Creators Network, Alfredo fights to ensure that every American has an opportunity to chase their own American dream through hard work and entrepreneurship. Thank you, Alfredo. We also have Scott Rasmussen. So excited, Scott. I'm always looking at your polls. They're fantastic. Once called a key player in the contact sport of politics by the Wall Street Journal, Scott Rasmussen is a well-known pollster and is currently president of RMG Research Incorporated. In the mid-1990s, Scott was a pioneer in the field of automated polling and led the transition away from operator-assisted polling. More than 20 years ago, he released the first ever daily presidential tracking poll. Since those long days ago, the era of phone polling has come to an end. Today, the political, polling, and media world continues to change, and Scott continues to innovate. I like that. Many public publishers ask questions and interpret the results from the perspective of a Georgetown cocktail party. That's a perspective few Americans share, developed in a language that few Americans speak. And I agree with you on that, Scott. But Scott prides himself in developing poll questions in the language of everyday Americans. And I think that's really important. I'm going to have a few questions for you, Scott, because a lot of people, they're back and forth. You talk to people, some people don't trust polls at all. Some people, have particular pollsters, and and you're one of the best at this. So maybe we'll get to some of those questions. Dina Bass Williams. I'm so grateful to have met you here. Dina is a partner at Bass Public Affairs, where she has been called upon by political leaders, business leaders, and national nonprofits to manage their messaging and their media. That's a huge, huge job, especially in this day and age. Previously, she served as the press secretary and spokesperson for U.S. Congressman Howard Buck McKeon. He's great. Director of Coalitions for U.S. Congresswoman Deborah Price, and Deputy Director of Coalitions to Ken Memel. Dina also served as the first executive director of the Gloucester Institute, founded by Charles and Kay Coles James. In addition to her national media relations experience, Dina served as a staff writer for the regional daily newspapers, covering issues related to local and state government and education reform. So many parents have so many questions about education reform. That's a huge issue this November. Her work as a staff writer and her experience as the news producer of a CBS affiliate gives her a keen appreciation for writing, editing, and messaging that appeals to grassroots audiences. In 2017, Dina took a leave of absence from Bass Public Affairs to serve as Deputy Chief of Staff to Dr. Ben Carson in his role as Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Wow, that's incredible, Dina. Can't wait to ask you a few questions too. And we also have with us Kenny Xu, a second generation Chinese American. Kenny is the president of Color Us United and serves as its primary spokesman. He has challenged Harvard University. Good for you. I don't know if I'd want to go up against them. Good for you. As he's challenged Harvard University for discrimination against Asian Americans, has worked as the director for media outreach against California Proposition 16, and has written for national publications like City Journal, The Federalist, The Daily Signal, and The Washington Examiner. He has been interviewed by the New York Times, NPR, the Epoch Times, Fox News, and others. His debuted his first book, An Inconvenient Minority, on the Ivy League discrimination cases and the lasting consequences of the left's diversity ideology in July 2021. Wow, this is incredible. This is such a great group to work with. And I really want to start out with, I think, one of the most important questions, and it goes to what I'm hearing across the country. And you talk about layman's terms, Scott, and maybe I'll just go right to you, Scott, because you talk about speaking in layman's terms. When I travel across the country, one of the biggest complaints during the election cycle, and this is going to be for everyone, is that our politicians and our lawmakers only pay attention to the communities when it's expedient for them, and especially minority communities, and when it's politically convenient for them. That they basically, they put a lot of attention at one particular point in time, months before an election, and then everybody just kind of walks away and forgets about them until the next election. In layman's terms, how do we get minority communities to trust what we're saying, even if it comes to your polls, and to believe that we are going to stick around for the long haul?
Well, Sarah, the first answer to that is you really have to be committed to sticking around for the long haul. Several years ago, I was talking to a number of members of Congress. They were more conservative than not, and they wanted to know, what are the words that we can use to convince minorities that we're on their side, that they should really like our policies? And my response was, it's not the words, you have to show up. You have to show up and explain your policies. You have to show up and explain, even if they don't agree with you, show up and make your case, and then show up again, even after you lose, and begin to make progress. It took about 40 years for Black Americans to become the party of Republicans, because in the 1920s, almost all Black voters were Republicans. It was the party of Abraham Lincoln. It took until after the 1960 John Kennedy, Richard Nixon election before Black voters became reliably Democratic. That took a lot of showing up for a lot of years for the Democrats to make those gains, and conservatives need to follow that model.
I think that's a really good point. Dina, going to you, he was talking about, Black American voters and that elongated time to shift from first being Republican, then sticking with Democrats, and then coming back. Maybe right now we're seeing a little bit of a comeback. What do you say?
I agree 100%. 20 years ago, I was a Hill staffer, and I can remember talking about showing up, and it sounded so sexy to say, show up, be there. But it's not sexy. It's actually just common sense. And even so now, 20 years later, that we are still saying, just show up. The NAACP, the National Urban League, Jack and Jill, the Divine Nine, Black sororities and fraternities, show up to the events. At our public affairs firm, we are hired often by conservative groups who want us to amplify their voice in minority communities, in the Black community in particular. And the first thing that we do is we ask, so how have you been engaging? How have you been attending, representing yourself at their events? You want Black people to come to your events. Have you ever gone to any of their events? So showing up, Scott, I mean, 100%. It sounds so simple, but we have to show up. And if we're not in the room, we will be defined by the people in the room who don't, we know 100%, we know that conservative policies improve lives for Black Americans, for moms, for school teachers, for America, period. We know that our policies improve lives, but if we're not there to tell people and to show, then we'll be defined by people who don't want us to have our message heard. So we've got to show up.
Great point. Kenny, how is it in the Asian communities? Is it similar? Are we seeing it as the Hispanic and Black communities? Are they also saying, hey, you don't show up, you're not talking to us, you're not communicating, or is there a different dynamic going on?
I think there's a different dynamic going on. Yes, Asian Americans have not shown up, so to speak, but do we want Asian Americans to show up when they're uninformed? A lot of them aren't even citizens, a lot of them don't even know that much about our country and our history, right? I don't think that the solution is overall voter turnout. There's a reason why people don't vote. I think that it's okay that you don't vote. If you're going to vote, vote on an educated basis. Vote on the policies that are actually going to affect you, your community, and your nation. Asian Americans, for so long, have been basically, the Democrats have used Asian Americans as a farming operation. Basically since the 1990s. Barack Obama and he had the highest percentage of Asian votes ever at over 70%. And the way that they did it was they played to one, identity politics, and two, this desire for the American dream. The Democrats are very good at this with Asian Americans. They said, number one, you're Asian, you're a minority, so you should vote with other minorities to vote for Democrats. And then number two, their other part of their pitch message was, we are Democrats. We believe in the land of opportunity. Opportunity should be available to all. That's why you should vote for us, right? Those are two messages that Barack Obama was able to harness to reach that high peak. Now, since it has declined from about 70% over to maybe 61% in the most recent election. But Republicans still have a lot of catching up to do, because one opening that I see with Asian Americans is the Democrats have stopped becoming the party of equal opportunity for all, and have started becoming the party of explicitly race-based measures. We're going to prioritize specifically Blacks and specifically Hispanics over Asian Americans, is what you're seeing with their new defense of Harvard's race-conscious admissions policies and their new equity measures in the city of Oakland, for example. Now,
before I get to Alfredo, explain that a little bit for our audience so that they understand what you are doing there at Harvard, because I think it's very important.
Yeah, so absolutely. So Harvard University has a thing called an affirmative action policy. And their affirmative action policy gives preferences to Black Americans, who are Black Americans and Hispanic Americans, less so for Hispanic Americans, mostly for Black Americans. But in the process, because Harvard is a zero-sum game, right? Everybody, you either get in or you don't get admitted. They have to eliminate some people from the admissions pool. So who do they eliminate? Well, they don't want to eliminate the rich white legacies who donate money. So they eliminate the Asian Americans who traditionally study really hard, work really hard for their opportunity to get into Harvard, believe in the American dream, and then just get denied because they look like me, and this is wrong. This is unfair. You should be treating people on the basis of merit. That's the essence of the American dream. The American dream says it doesn't matter what color of your skin you are, you'll get an equal shot at this country based on your hard work, right? And it just so happens Asians study really hard for the opportunities that they get. They study twice as many hours as the average American, and yet Harvard would accept a Black American who has SAT scores 270 points lower than an Asian American, and deny an Asian American the same thing. So I'm using this case to show that the Democrats' equity case is explicitly anti-Asian, and it's anti-meritocracy. It's anti-American dream. So if Republicans can get out that message, they have a strong chance of winning Asian American voters.
That's a really, really interesting and very important point, because I think for all of us, when we hear it, whether we're hearing it from you, Kenny, whether we're hearing it, and then I'm going to go to you, Alfredo, you, Dina, or Alfredo, whatever group we're talking about, it's a reality that's kind of like a gut punch. Like, where are our priorities? What are we going to do? And are we doing enough for other communities? Because it's frankly quite insulting too, right? To other groups to say, well, you can only achieve this much, but we're going to kick out them and we're going to let you in. No, it's frankly, I would assume, quite insulting to other groups. Alfredo, talk about this as far as, going back to the original question here, what do you think needs to be done more? And how would you reach out to the layman, telling them, and especially the Hispanic community, which is growing by leaps and bounds in America? I mean, that's frankly one of the biggest minority groups. It won't be a minority for long, growing in America. So talk a little bit about that in layman's terms. How do you address those issues with the Hispanic community as a Republican?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And I think the comments that have already been said have a lot of applicability to the Hispanic market as well. I mean, the one thing that the Democrats seem to do extremely well, which is actually now, quite frankly, probably counterproductive to what's happening with their inroads into the Hispanic market in particular is race-based politics, identity politics. For them, it is about the color of your skin versus, anything else. And, I'm an old consumer goods marketer, Sarah, I think you know that. And the one thing that we found in doing all of our research is that people are actually more similar than they are different. And the one thing I think that we can keep talking about as conservatives, as Republicans, is our similarities versus our differences, because that is all that the Democrats seem to be really talking about, which is kind of ironic given that you had Martin Luther King basically, make that point that, you shouldn't judge people by the color of their skin. But now that's exactly what's happening. I mean, look what our vice president said about the hurricane relief, that it should be prioritized based on the color of your skin. And that's just not right. I mean, the people that were affected were rich, were poor, were white, were green, blue, yellow. It shouldn't be, based on race. It should be based on the color of your skin. And so I think what we need to talk about, and I heard a few people use this word, but it's opportunity. I think we got to be clear that this is the party of opportunity. At Job Creators Network, we launched this year the Great Opportunity Project, which was our humble attempt to redefine the GOP, from the grand old party to this great opportunity project, because that's what it is. I think Republicans know what it takes to make sure that everybody has equal opportunity, not equal outcome. This was never promised was equal outcome. Equal opportunity, I think, is what we always have promised. And that's what we want to deliver. But we do have to be there before, during, and after an election. We are horrible about what I call kind of drive-by focus on these on minority groups, where we are there maybe only 30, 45, maybe even 60 days before an election, and then we go away. That's the one thing that the Democrats did do consistently, is once they got into the different ethnic groups, they stayed there, right? And they stayed there and they focused. But right now they've lost their way, Sarah, I think, in terms of how they're focusing and what they're doing there. And when we find these commonalities, though, look what happened in Virginia, Sarah, with Governor Youngkin. He got 52% of the Hispanic vote. I mean, that's pretty darn amazing. And is it because he had, signs in Spanish, or because he had Spanish radio ads? That helped. But that wasn't the reason why he took 52% of the Hispanic vote. It's because he found the commonalities that existed with whites, with blacks, Hispanics, et cetera. In particular, for example, parental power and parental empowerment when it comes to how you take care of your kids. That was a very relevant conversation and a relevant point that Governor Youngkin was making in his race. That did ring true amongst Hispanics, amongst blacks, amongst Asians, amongst whites. And so I think, my advice on this one is really, if we can focus more on what commonalities we have, and what in the consumer goods world we would call need states, which is a deeper level than just the color of your skin and the language you speak. I think you'll be better off. For example, talking about, again, the party of opportunity.
I think that's a really good point. And I also, going back to this, what Kenny was talking about and what you were saying, Alfredo, as far as identity politics and the Democratic Party, that's something that we're not going to be able to avoid this November. That is something that is definitely going to be a big challenge for Republicans. Like you said, people just can't come in and out of communities. It has to be a deliverable message, one that is long lasting. People have to believe, they have to feel that something is going to be different and that something is going to change. So I'm going to drop the question over. I'm going to go to Dina actually on this one, because I think just coming off of the whole, from Harvard and looking at what Kenny is doing right now with, and talking about this idea of identity politics and the Black community in Harvard, I want to give you a chance to respond to that, and also talk a little bit about what can conservatives do. Really, like Alfredo said, looking at economics and opportunity, what are the tangible things that the conservative movement, the Republicans, can do to really get people vested in the party, that are from communities that are impoverished or that have had, very little response from Republicans in the past? What can we do to change that?
So first of all, I think that Republicans need to not be so afraid of engaging Black communities. And by that, I mean, we talk about identity politics, but then we define identity politics as going to reach out to Black people, like going to, like having an actual plan to engage the Black community. That doesn't mean going to change the message or to change the policy, but I don't find it identity politics to recognize that there are places where Black people convene, whether it's the church, through, like I said before, these Divine Nine sororities and fraternities. Like there are places where Black people are and non-Black people are not in those places. And we as conservatives need to go to those places. And I don't find that as identity politics. Like there, as a communicator, there are certain, we are a mainstream public affairs firm. We are right of center, but on our distribution list, like we have everyone from CNBC, MSNBC, to the Hazel Trice Edney Newswire, to NNPA, to the GRIO. Like if you are a conservative organization and you're not using the Hazel Trice Edney Newswire, then I question whether you actually have a serious intent to share your message with everyone. Hazel Trice reaches Black media outlets all over the country that are read by everyone from the housekeepers to the judges, to the teachers, to the plumbers, right? So this knee-jerk to identity politics, I think we need to define it as what it is. I don't think we should be, as Kenny is saying, giving merit when there is no merit, like advancing people into educational systems when they didn't earn the right to be there. But to me, identity politics is not saying, hey, Black people are Deltas. My sister and my mom are proud members of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Let's go reach out to the Deltas. I don't find that, I'm confused as to why we don't see how valuable that is. One last thing, my nephew, love him to pieces. I'm a professional aunt, no kids. I have a 15-year-old nephew and a 15-year-old niece and a 20-year-old nephew. My nephew attends an HBCU, and he is so far right of center. He and his friends are so like these young Black men on HBCU campuses who are entrepreneurs, who are free market thinkers, who don't have this 20-year allegiance, 30-year allegiance to Democrats. We have to be on campuses, not just HBCU campuses, but on campuses talking to young people aggressively, and because that's where the future is. That's where the future of this ideology is, and the future of the Republican Party is.
Brilliant. And yeah, it's just getting out there and being vested and involved and just talking to people, right? Just being out there, outreach. The message is strong, right, Scott? I mean, if you're polling, the message, conservative polling, I mean, it's an idea. It really isn't. It's like Dina says, it's not about identity politics. And Alfredo said it, and Kenny said it too. It's about job creation, capitalism, learning how to be your best, having the tools that you need to build your life. Talk a little bit about the polls that you're doing when you are reaching out and trying to see those shifts in the community, and what you do, I guess, to ensure that the polling that you're getting is an accurate assessment of those shifts.
Well, actually, before I do that, Sarah, I want to lift up a question or an issue about the whole concept of identity politics as we talk about it today. The myth, the storyline, the narrative is that America was a white, homogenous society until the last few decades, and all of a sudden it's become diverse. That tends to be, now, there were issues with slavery and there were things there, but always in America, there have been minorities. 100 years ago, Italians and Polish Americans and Jewish Americans were not counted as white. If you go back to the first Continental Congress, before the Second Continental Congress declared independence, they all agreed on the very first motion that they should begin their session with a prayer. And then they had a 2-day argument about who should lead the prayer. Why? because in the 18th century, religious differences mattered a lot. My own grandparents, my mother's parents were a Catholic and an Episcopalian. They were not allowed to date, so they eloped, and they were disowned by their families because religion was a divide. So we get to today, and yes, there are racial differences. And yes, we need to go into communities, into sororities and fraternities that are beyond the normal conservative place. But we also need to recognize that the definition of minorities is pretty fluid. The Census Bureau has a definition of who's Hispanic, but half of Hispanic voters do not consider themselves to be Hispanic. They are either white or American, and generally that's people whose families have been here for a couple of generations. So when you start talking about this, you have to first get rid of the notion that there are rigid boundaries and, oh, we're going to find these magic words when we go to the Black community, the Hispanic community. No, what works are appeals to the core ideals of freedom, equality, self-governance, the land of opportunity. Picture this. In my polling, it shows that one of the things that immigrant parents want when they come to America, what they want from our education system, is to help their children assimilate into American society. So now you move to this country, you want to be here because it's the land of opportunity. You send your child to school to become a part of this society, and they come home and say, Mommy, the teacher told me that America is a bad place. Mm-hmm. What is wrong with this picture? That's why you want more involvement. And I go back to these root issues because there are lots of ways to slice and dice data. People who are entrepreneurs have more in common with each other, regardless of whether they're white, Black, Hispanic, or Asian, or anything else, than they do with people who work for large corporations or people who work for a government bureaucracy. Their young parents are in an entirely different place in their life than my wife and I are, because that's just one of the things. I have a lot more in common with people who are my own age. So we need to think about ways, what is it that unites us? And Alfredo hit it right away. Americans are far more united than the political process shows, because the political process is designed to divide people right now. And the successful plan, the successful messages will be those that you can walk into a Black fraternity or sorority and give your core message. And obviously you're aware of where you're speaking, who you're talking to, and what their experiences are, but that you can walk out and give that exact same message to another group. That's the winning message.
That's
and if I could chime in on that, Sarah, really quickly.
Yeah,
as well.
Absolutely.
Because the term cultural relevancy, I think, is what is really important to talk about. Because, and Scott said it, you have a core message that you want to deliver, but you have to understand, to Dina's point, who you're talking to, where you're talking about it, right? And that's the cultural relevancy that we have to understand and know and be knowledgeable about. But you don't change your core message based on which ethnic group you're talking to, right? So for example, you look at the six of us on the screen, we all have very different backgrounds. We all have different color skin, right? We have different upbringings, but we all share probably one or two very common core values, which brings us to this point today, right? Opportunity, work ethic, I mean, you name it, right? But there are some underlying core values that unite us, right? And again, I use Governor Youngkin as probably the best example, because it's the nearest example of really an upset victory in that state. But that's because the core messages were clearly understood and clearly delivered in a culturally relevant way. And I think that's the important part, is that just because you're Black or you're Asian or you're Hispanic or white or Nordic, doesn't mean that the core message needs to change per group. It's the cultural relevancy that changes around that core message. And so it's a nuance, but a really important one, because if you start changing your core message based on the ethnic group that you're talking to, then you really don't stand for anything to anybody.
Then you're a Democrat. No, I'm just joking. I'm just
Look,
joking. I just had to throw that one out there. I want to go to Kenny, because I think this is important, because really, we've evolved this conversation based on what, you were talking about, which is really relevant, Kenny. I mean, and I think it's important for all of us to understand that, I think that Alfredo's right. The core message, we saw that when it came to Loudoun County. I have friends in Loudoun County, Virginia, when the school districts began, they started seeing what was happening inside the school with the teaching of CRT and with other issues that came up, especially during a really difficult time in our nation. We were dealing with COVID and we were dealing with lockdowns and various other measures that we hadn't dealt before, but it united parents. It united parents regardless. And my friend, one of my best friends, and she'll just be like, is Jonna. She's Filipino American. And she said she was so insulted. She has 2 little girls. Her husband's, works in the Pentagon. And she remembers her daughters coming home from Loudoun County School District one day and saying to her, Mommy, we're not privileged. My teacher told me because I'm not white, I'm not privileged. She had 2 little twin girls. And she was like, what? What is that? What are you talking about? Do you think, she obviously went to school. She was part of the groups that went in on campus and eventually, stood up for their children publicly. And of course, it was a national movement after that. And Governor Youngkin got elected. Issues like that, because you're dealing with Harvard, you're dealing with education. Those transgress all culture. Do you think that's going to be a big issue come this November for midterms? Is our children's education and parents more so than anything else? And is that a great way of maybe reaching out to all Americans, regardless of color, regardless of economic backgrounds, of just really focusing on the issues that conservatives, I think, are winning at right now?
I think it depends on the cohort. So in Arizona, for example, what is it? I think the Fox News poll said that 17% of the people thought that border security was the most important issue for them, or was a very important issue for them. And then 17% said the preservation of democracy, which of course is a Democratic leading issue, is important to them. And only 3% said that education was this very important issue for them. But in Loudoun County, it's different, because everybody here who's familiar with Loudoun County knows that it's a wealthy area. The parents are ambitious. They're ambitious for their children. They want their children to get a really high quality education. It's really important to them. And that, I think, leads me to the point that I agree with Alfredo on, which is that you can't just paint every minority as the same voting bloc. People are like, why can't Republicans reach Black Americans and everything like that? Well, where do Black Americans typically congregate? Urban areas, right? Yes, there are rural contingents of Black Americans that are actually more conservative. In rural North Carolina, for example, there's a District 1 in rural North Carolina, where the Black Americans behave very similarly to a conservative white American who comes from a certain socioeconomic background. But they still vote for Democrats. So there's a race issue there, but that is getting less blue and more red. But the thing is, Republicans have shifted their strategy to targeting rural voters. I saw this myself when I went and did very basic campaign efforts for Kelly Loeffler in Georgia in the 2020 Senate seat, which she lost. The only districts that I was assigned to go to as a volunteer or a barely paid staffer was like far out rural districts. We were not competing in Atlanta. We were not competing even in the suburbs or the educated parts of the Atlanta suburbs. And so who were mostly people there? They're mostly whites. It's not like we were racist. It's not like we had a racist strategy. It's just that we ignored, or we thought that the rural vote would bring us the vote. And what are Republicans trying to do? What are Republican political consultants trying to do? They're always thinking, what's going to help me win this election? So until we as conservatives can make the case that the urban areas, which are more minority, are actually more open for the taking, Republican campaign staffers are not going to care about them. And they're not going to listen to us. So yeah, that's my thought on this whole thing. You know, urban areas, what's their case for instead of thinking what's their case for Black America, maybe we should think what's their case for inner city diverse urban America. What's their case for that? That's how we should be thinking about it.
Kenny, Sarah, I'm sorry. I want to
No,
jump in.
I'm glad you did.
I think that you just hit on something really important. When you're talking about a campaign, your job is to win. You're going to go where the votes are because that's how you win a campaign. There is no incentive for an individual candidate to go to a community that is not going to produce a lot of votes. However, there is an incentive for the party to invest long-term in those, for a movement to invest long-term. If I was putting this in the context of this election and the next, what that would look like is in between now and November, Republican candidates, conservative candidates should be going to places where they're going to find enough votes to win the election. And they shouldn't be thinking about how do I affect the long-term balance. However, starting November 9th, and with a new Congress coming in early next year, there should be a tremendous effort to go into these communities, make your case, and spend a year doing that. And then, you know what? You get back to an election in 2024, you want to stay there, but you have to invest. You have to recognize that the party's interests, the movement's interests are not the same as an individual candidate. You have to show up when it matters.
And Scott, sorry, Sarah.
Yeah.
But just to drive that point, though, as somebody who started getting involved in politics all the way back to the days of RNC Chairman Steele, so that's a few years back, if you all remember him, our starts and stops of this party are ridiculous when it comes to whether it's Black outreach, Hispanic outreach, Asian outreach. Like I said, we started maybe 60, 90 days before an election.
Right.
The election happens, we see how we did, and then we go, all right, see you in 2 years. And it's just the start and stop and start and stop. I really handed, I applaud the Democrats because their consistency and the longevity in terms of, their thought process of we're going to stay in this one for the long run. We need to have that mentality. And frankly, Scott, I just don't see our party doing that. We have to do it. I haven't seen them do it. They say it all the time. I can't tell you how many chairmen I've heard, right after the election saying, we're going to, for the next one, we're going to be out there. We're going to spend tens of millions of dollars on Hispanic, on Black, on Asian. And then all of a sudden it's like $1 million, right? Mm-hmm. And we have to commit it. We have to leave it in there. We have to get the best people to focus on it and stay for longer.
Dina?
Absolutely. Alfredo, I actually have a longevity on you. I've worked on my first campaign when I was 11 years old. That was 39 years ago. My sister and I worked to help elect the first Black woman to the city council in our hometown, Columbus, Georgia. She happened to be a Republican. And I say that because my mom, I come from a conservative family, Christian family. And so people always say, well, Blacks are naturally conservative. Why aren't they Republicans? Well, over 40 years ago, someone invited my mom to a county committee meeting as a Republican, and she was engaged. And so our family, we are outliers in our family. Everyone in my family, they are not Republicans. They are conservative, but they don't identify as such. But it was because someone 40 years ago actually invited my mom to be a part of the team, to sit at the table, not to just come and participate, look at it, but to actually sit at the table and to be a part of it. And so all these years later, we are invested, literally card-carrying conservative Republicans. And so there is something about relationship. And I even think in my own life, I generally vote for Republicans, but the Democrats and I'm not going to do names on this panel, but there's a Democrat in Congress who is such a good family friend that we actually, our firm would not work to campaign with the Republican who opposed him. And we literally supported everything that this Republican who opposed him stood for. But because of this long-term relationship with a Democrat, we wouldn't work against him. And so there's something to be said. I mean, I'm not saying that it's right or wrong. I'm saying that there's something real about building relationships with people, you know, and so
Dina,
if I had $1 for every time a Republican said the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln, Abe Lincoln is not helping me pay my mortgage today.
Right.
You know, so that has not, like, I'm glad that the Republican Party is a party of Abe Lincoln, but until Abe Lincoln rises from the grave and helps me pay my mortgage, that means absolutely nothing to Black Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And Dina, when you talk about this personal experience, it does have long-lasting consequences. There's a Black theologian, Howard Thuman, whose grandmother was a slave, and wasn't ever taught to read, and he was asked to read her scripture every day when he lived with her. And over time, he realized she never had him read anything from the Apostle Paul. Why? Because the only time his grandmother heard about scripture from a white preacher was quoting Paul saying, "Slaves, obey your masters." Wow. Now, this theologian ended up going to college with Martin Luther King Sr. and having a big impact in building the relationships and the network for Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement. Came out of a time when the Republicans were the party of Lincoln, but that wasn't the experience he got, that personal experience his grandmother had that impacted him and the future of his family connections, going in the opposite direction of Dina's. But that is it. When somebody connects with you, whether it's relevant to your place in the world, whether it's a personal experience, that is a lasting impact.
And I got to say, Dina, and for Kenny and Scott and Alfredo, that was what I experienced. Well, when I was in Braddock, just talking to folks, you know, walking around the community, it's a small community, 1,800 people, wanted to know how people felt about Fetterman, how they felt about what was happening in their community. And one of the most poignant moments was a gentleman who said, well, look, I know Fetterman. He walks around with his sweatshirt, and sometimes he's talking to us, and sometimes he's on the sidewalk and buying a hot dog from our little stand here. But I never see anybody else in the community. I don't know anyone else. He's like, I don't agree with him, but I don't know anyone else. And I think it goes right to your point. You know, people have to show their face. So I see we're at already 12:48, but I want to give everybody. So what I guess maybe like, what would be the three things? And I'll start this time with Kenny. What would be the three things that you would recommend to those viewing, you know, and wanting to be more vested in what's happening in our country, bringing more people to the conservative movement, you know, explaining to people why it is important, you know, to not only for them, but for democracy to be, you know, to move towards in this direction. How would you do that kind of outreach, Kenny? What would be the 3 bits of advice that you would give?
Wow, the 3 bits of advice that I give to reach the entire minority population in America.
I'm not asking a lot.
So I'm just kidding. Let's see. I mean, if I had to be extremely general, I could say, number 1, hire a translator. Number 1, there's a lot of voters. You know how like when the internet was young, somebody could make a company and with relatively little effort, make it a monopoly. Now that's no longer the case. You know, it's sort of like, that's the case with a voter. You know, do you want to target the saturated person over and over again? Or do you want to target the young person the young immigrant who just got naturalized, who has no idea what political party they support? How much capital would you have to spend to convince the old voter who's been here forever and knows exactly what party he's going to vote for, compared to the amount of capital that you would spend targeting the new immigrant who doesn't know anything about this country, who barely speaks the language? I think that's where you could get your most efficient return. So that's what I would say.
That's excellent. Alfredo?
All right. Let's see. The 3 pieces of advice. I think I would start off with truly understand your core message that can define who we are about. I would say opportunity would be a great place to start. Two, deliver that message, that core message in a culturally relevant way. And three, stick with it. That's
Scott?
I think the first thing I would do is I would not try to convince somebody to be a conservative or to embrace conservative views. I think I would encourage them to embrace America's founding ideals of freedom, equality, and self-governance. That's what unites us. Second, in terms of, in Alfredo's phrase, cultural relevance, recognize how the person you are speaking to might interpret that or might hear that, or what would it be that they might be skeptical about your truth to that. And third, I would agree with Alfredo, stick to it. Have your message, understand how you're communicating it, and then keep saying it. A preacher that I knew said that you preach vision until you're ready to vomit. And by the time you do that, everybody else is just starting to get the message.
I like that. Dina?
At Bass Public Affairs, we talk about the 3 C's in everything: clarity, courage, and competence. So I think if I'm talking to conservative organizations, to Republicans in general, I say have a clear message. And for us, we do talk about an opportunity agenda. And as we are working to reach African Americans, Black Americans, the opportunity agenda, that message from the Republican Party, from the conservative, from conservative policies. So clarity of message, the courage to actually do it. You know, a lot of people are afraid to, they don't want to go to an NAACP event because people, they don't agree with us. So what? I mean, I don't agree with most people in my family, but I'm not going to avoid it, right? So the courage to actually go and do, and like the courage to be there, as Scott was saying, the courage, just to show up. And competence, I feel like we as conservatives are not always competent in our messaging. And often that repels people. And I believe that when we are competent in our messaging, when we are competent in the tools that we're using, we have a better chance of being effective in reaching other groups, whether they're women, soccer moms, whoever. So like the competence in the message. So we say clarity, courage, and competence.
Wow, I think that was just excellent. I feel like that really just hones in on everything. And it's true. I think reaching out, and I'm so grateful that all of you brought this up, because this is something I hear every time I travel. We're so divided now as a nation, and that's so unfortunate. We used to be able to sit at the table, even if we had an aunt who was a Democrat or a Republican, or whatever party we associated with. We could talk. We could talk without, without harmful divisions, and without, shutting the door on one another. We would have open door for discussion. And I think a lot of Americans now are really afraid. And what you're saying, Dina, and everyone, Scott, as well as Kenny and Alfredo, get out there. Don't be afraid. It's the only way to break this, I think, this stigma that we have on one another, especially in these really politically divisive times. And Alfredo, because it's JCN, I want to give it back to you before we wrap this up. I want to give you an opportunity to talk about, as we end this, American small business owners, and the importance of really, I think, reaching everyone, regardless of what minority group you belong to. The most important thing is being able to be a part of that American dream. And I want to give that to you.
Well, thank you. Yeah. So, small businesses in this country really are the heartbeat of America. 30 million small businesses, Sarah, as you know, employ about 60 million people. So you're talking about 90 million hardworking Americans that are really dependent on the success or failure of small business. Whenever I'm out speaking to folks, I go, look, we might be unapologetically conservative when it comes to economy and stuff like that. We promote lower taxes, less regulations, but we're not out there saying we're standing for Republican small businesses only. If you're a small business owner at Job Creators Network, you're going to get our advocacy. I don't care if you're black, yellow, green, blue, red. I don't care if you're a Democrat, independent, or Republican, right? And that actually is a great position, I think, for us, because then we are talking about opportunity, right? That is pretty much our focus. Our big project of the year, again, that we launched and will continue for the next few years, of course, is the Great Opportunity Project, because I believe that's what this party is about. And when you talk about small business and entrepreneurship and opportunity, those are very relevant themes. They're very relevant messages that cross whether you're Black, Hispanic, Asian, white, right? Because you do address those at a deeper level and a deeper need state. You know, I would probably think too, one thing, Sarah, came to mind as I'll add a fourth piece of recommendation, and is based on what Scott said, is, you know, don't force people to try to, you know, into boxes. Ask questions. You know, do you believe in opportunity? Do you believe in hard work? Do you believe that hard work leads to incredible upside and opportunity? Should you have unfettered opportunity, right? You start asking those questions, let people self-identify, because I think that's what happened again in Virginia. People said, yeah, I like that. That sounds what I want. That sounds like what I believe in. And I think the more we do that and we ask questions rather than try to impose our will on people, I think we're better off. And so again, just going back to small businesses, I mean, that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to make sure that all small businesses have the greatest opportunity possible. And if you're willing to put everything that you have on the line, which, you know, I own a small business, 2 of them, I put everything on the line. I should have unfettered upside because I'm taking the full risk. And we shouldn't have government impede that success or tell you, hey, you know what? You've achieved enough. We're going to take the rest of it. And so we're going to keep on pushing for that. And that's what at Job Creators Network, we encourage people, if you like what you hear, you know, go to joinjcn.com and be part of the fight.
Well, I want to say thank you to everyone before I turn this over back to Jamie Bowers. Thank you, Dina Bass-Williams. Amazing. Scott Rasmussen, I always love talking to you as well. Such insight. Kenny Zhu, thank you so much for explaining and really bringing to light the issues that are facing Asian Americans. And Alfredo Ortiz, last but not least, thank you so much for hosting such an incredible event. I think we've all learned so much. And I think events like this and talking more and having more events like this is going to benefit all of us, because it's not going to let us forget that we can't forget the American people. We're all immigrants. We all came from somewhere. We've all, you know, had our own story to tell. And it's about time that our lawmakers remember who's boss, and that's the American people.